Macbeth's soliloquy at the start of Act 1, Scene 7, which we looked at in the previous video, we can see that he's really doubtful about whether he should commit the crime of regicide, and he seems to be planning not to do it. But then in comes Lady Macbeth, and by the end of the scene, he's convinced that he is going to do it. So he starts the scene by saying, "We will proceed no further in this business," but he ends the scene by saying, "I'm settled and bend up every corporal agent to this terrible feat." So he's gone from saying, "I'm not doing it," to "I'm going to do it, I'm ready to do it." How did that all happen? Because of the amazing powers of persuasion of Lady Macbeth. And in this video, we're going to find out how she convinces her husband to commit the crime. In our video on the discussion between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 5, we talked about how dominant she was, how much she was the one in control. In that scene, she started the conversation, she ended the conversation, he hardly had any lines at all, and we could see that she was pushing him along in the way she wanted to go. But this conversation, at least at the start, appears to be slightly different. He is the one who talks first. She talks with a couple of short lines, and then he gets quite a long speech in which he says, "We will proceed no further in this business." Look at that strong modal verb will, and that strong language, no further. He's laying down the law. He's saying, no, we're not going to go on with this. And that is what the Jacobean audience would expect from a man, being in control, being dominant. So it looks at the start here as if we're going back towards the expected gender roles of the day. But no, Lady Macbeth hasn't had her say yet. She's only just getting going. And she manages to persuade him with some incredible techniques, which anybody who wants to persuade anybody should really study if they want to get what they want out of someone else. Although I'm not advocating for murder here, obviously. So how does she do it? Well, let's look at a few of the key techniques which she uses. Now, one of the main ways she tries to persuade him is what members of a modern audience and students of mine might refer to as gaslighting, which is a phrase that I completely hate, largely because I know that most examiners are quite an old bunch, and if you use the word gaslighting in an exam paper, they're probably going to give it a massive cross and think, what the hell are they talking about? So I would avoid that word. Gaslighting, if you look up what it means using your powers of manipulation to sow the seed of doubt into someone's mind about their own sanity. So what I would say instead of gaslighting would be a phrase such as, she uses psychological manipulation to sow seeds of doubt in his mind, something like that. And the doubt she sows in his mind is the doubt about where the plan came from. Now, if you remember back in Act 1, Scene 5, she was reading his letter, he was telling her about the witches, then he came in, he said, "Duncan's staying here," and she said, "He's never going to leave, he's going to die here tonight." She expressed the idea of committing murder. But in this scene, she makes it sound like he was the one who first suggested the idea of murder. She says to him,
"Was the Hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself?"
As in, you came up with the idea of being the king. What happened to that? And then later on she says,
"What beast was it then that made you break this enterprise to me?"
What made you tell me this plan? But we've got no evidence that he was the one who told her the plan at all. All the evidence points to the contrary, that she told him the plan. But she's a quicker thinker than him, and he doesn't stop to think, hang on a minute, weren't you the one who told me the plan? He just gets rolled up in her thoughts and whisked away by her quick wits. And in fact, that's the second thing I wanted to come on to, which is this idea of her being incredibly quick-witted. He comes up with an image or an idea, and she immediately takes that idea and turns it back on him. You see this often with really clever characters in Shakespearean drama. Hamlet is a great example of this. He'll take someone else's metaphor and he'll throw it back at them in a different way, and he'll run rings around them mentally. And Lady Macbeth does that with her husband here. I mean, look at the time when he says to her,
"I have bought golden opinions from all sorts of people, which would be worn now in their newest gloss, not cast aside so soon."
And she says to him,
Was the Hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself?
He's taken this clothing imagery, and we talked about clothing imagery in a different video, but he takes a clothing image here. Hey, I want to wear the good opinions of other people. And she takes the idea of him being dressed, but she says, well, you were dressed in hope before. What's happened to that hope you dressed yourself in? So she takes his metaphor and she twists it and she throws it back at him as something else. She does that again immediately afterwards when they start talking about manliness. And we'll talk in a few more minutes about what exactly that conversation about manliness is. But for now, just notice that he says,
I dare do all that may become a man, who dares do more is none.
And she says,
What beast was it then that made you break this enterprise to me?
so he's talking about being a man, and she takes his image of being a man and she turns it back and said, well, when you came up with this idea, you must have been being a beast, not a man, but a beast. So she takes his metaphor, twists it and throws it back in his face. Later on, much more simply, he says,
If we should fail,
what happens if we fail? And she says,
We fail.
or if you read it with a question mark, because the punctuation is not entirely clear for that line, she could be saying it kind of rhetorically as a rhetorical question. We fail, as in there's no chance we're going to fail. So again, she can just take his words and throw them back at him straight away. So she's this sharp-witted character, which is something to note about her powers of persuasion. But the main way she persuades him is by bringing up this idea of what it means to be a man. And we talked about this when we talked about her in the video for Act 1, Scene 5. She's really a woman who challenges gender stereotypes, who challenges gender conventions. She's the one at the beginning saying, I feel that you're too full of the milk of human kindness. You're too much of a feminine or a womanly man to do what you need to do to become the king. And she talks in a controlling and a dominant way. And we talked about how the Jacobeans would expect a man to be like that. So she's already challenging ideas of masculinity. But here the conversation about masculinity is extremely explicit, particularly in the section where he says,
I dare do all that may become a man, who dares do more is none.
and she says,
When you durst do it, then you were a man. And to be more than what you were, you would be so much more the man.
fascinating. Let's go through what they both mean by manliness here. Now, Macbeth's comments could be interpreted in two ways. One of the ways of interpreting his comments is that he's saying, I dare do all that may become a man, that is fitting for a man to do. Who dares do more is none. Nobody does more than me. Nobody's a better man than me. That's one way of interpreting his words. But another way of his words being interpreted is him saying, who dares do more is none. Who dares go beyond a certain point is none. It could mean is not a man anymore, becomes unmanly somehow, which she then takes up when she says, well, what beast was it then that suggested this to me? She's saying, oh, well, then you were being a beast or a non-man or a non-good man when you suggested this to me in the first place. So he's sort of either saying, I'm the bravest man there is, or he's saying, I'm a really moral man and I will go to this point but no further to prove my manliness. So there are two concepts of manliness there, bravery and morality, being the right kind of a man, what becomes a man, to use Macbeth's language himself. But she goes further. She says a man is someone who does everything it takes to get what he wants. That's when she says, when you durst do it, then you were a man. And to be more than what you were, you would be so much more the man. She's saying a real man does anything it takes. So we've got these different concepts of manliness. On the one hand, we've got valour. On the other hand, we've got, also coming from Macbeth, this idea that there are moral limits beyond which a man should not go. But then in Lady Macbeth's mind, a man should be completely ruthless in doing everything it takes. And so these ideas of manliness are being thrown around here. And in fact, this becomes incredibly important in the play. And we'll talk about it further on in future scenes. What does it mean to be a man? There are all kinds of men in this play. There's Duncan, there's Banquo, there's Macduff. And we have to, in the audience, look at these different examples of manliness and start to consider what is the right example of manliness. In the same way that we have to look at these examples of being a woman in Lady Macbeth, in perhaps The Witches, in Lady Macduff, and we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the right way of being a woman? So gender is extremely important in this play, and this is a key moment and a very quotable moment for discussing that. So bear in mind these conversations about manliness, which are in fact the way that she really manages to persuade him. She says a man would do anything it takes. She comes up with this ruthless argument, and to a Jacobean audience this would seem like a more brutal and therefore more masculine, a less soft argument. And it really persuades him, doesn't it? Because after she then tells him the entire plan and outlines it in a very controlling and dominant way, which again makes her seem like she's in the role of a man, he then says,
"Bring forth men children only, for thy undaunted metal should compose nothing but males."
As in, you know, you are such a manly person that you should give birth to only men. He's basically recognising how masculine she is in her outlook, and it completely persuades him. So there you go. She's come up with 3 ways of persuading him. Take note if you want to be an arch-manipulator. One of them is gaslighting. One of them is being incredibly quick-witted and turning people's ideas back on them. And the third one is to question a man's manliness if you really want to get him to do what you want. I'm not saying you should do all these things, by the way, but I'm just saying that Lady Macbeth is an example of a person who does successfully manage to do that. So by the end of the scene, she's completely convinced him to go for it, so that he finishes the scene, and the act, in fact, ends with the words,
"I am settled, and bend up each corporal agent to this terrible feat. Away, and mock the time with fairest show. False face must hide what the false heart doth know."
Great end to the act. There it is again, that word fair, fairest show. He's saying, let's look fair, let's look nice, let's look good. But underneath, we've got false hearts. In fact, our faces are being false because we've got these dark hearts, these corrupt hearts. He's really buying into her vision of looking like the innocent flower, but being the serpent under it that she brought up in Act 1, Scene 5. At that point, he was like, oh, let's talk more about this. But now he's going for it. She's completely persuaded him, and he's even thinking like her. He's like, yep, we're going to do it, and we're going to be duplicitous. He's very solid in his determination at the end here. Look at the rhyming couplet, show and know. That is a very classic way of Shakespeare ending an act with a rhyming couplet. And here it gives this sense of strength of purpose and that he really wants to go for it. So why did Shakespeare write the play in this way? What's he doing? Why does he make this horrible creature of Lady Macbeth, and Macbeth himself being so weak-minded? Well, what I really think is he's showing you power dynamics between people. It doesn't really have to be the power dynamic between a woman and a man, but it's certainly the power dynamic between someone who's quite confused in their thinking, as we saw when we were talking about the soliloquy for Act 1, Scene 7. He's just not really very sure. And someone who is quick-witted, who is very manipulative, who knows how to push someone else's buttons to get what they want. And when you put those two kinds of people together, you get this result where the quick-witted one gets what they want. And of course, Shakespeare is showing us that that's how a tragedy can unfold. Later on, we look back on this scene and this moment, and we realise that we've got all the seeds of the tragedy in Act 1. We've got his ambition, his moral doubt. We've got Lady Macbeth's ruthlessness and her brilliant powers of persuasion and control that convince him. And we've also got these witches. Are they the voices of fate, or are they manipulative figures themselves? All of these elements are there. Put them all together, boom, a crime is committed, a tragedy occurs. That's what we'll look at in the next video.